Shalom, this is Chris. We're following Jesus along the Talmudim way. Lesson 54, we're calling this one Inside Out. We took a bit of a break from recording, and now we're back at it. We're resuming in Luke chapter 11, beginning with verse 37. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans, who receive the word with all eagerness, but who examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. By this teaching, enable each of us to be doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask these things in Jesus' name. We're calling this one Inside Out because in this passage, God seems to go out of his way to tell us that it's the attitude of our hearts that is what is most important, and yet we, both the people in that day and us today, think we can get by on appearances and external rituals only. And I've got the symbol of a mint leaf because we'll see in this passage that the Pharisees tied their mint dutifully to fulfill the law as they saw it, but their hearts just weren't in it. And we're going to see there's a lot of application for our day, which we'll see as we work through this passage. Luke 11, verse 37. Now, when he had spoken, a Pharisee asked him to have lunch with him, and he went in and reclined at the table. So the last section was another of Jesus's discourses on light versus darkness, spiritual sight versus spiritual blindness, as we've been studying the past several lessons here. But apparently, moved by those remarks, this Pharisee practically interrupts Jesus. The Greek actually implies that while Jesus was speaking, he invited him, not after he spoke. And he extends a meal invitation. Luke loves his banquets because this is the fourth out of 7 in his gospel. We've got Luke 5:29, 7:36, chapter 9, this one here in 11, there's another one in 14, and then 2 towards the end of Jesus' ministry in chapter 22 and chapter 24. This passage is going to be full of specific examples where man and woman look at the external, but it is God who sees the heart. And that just reminds me of 1 Samuel 16. This is where Samuel goes to anoint the next king after Saul, and he goes to the house of Jesse. Jesse parades 6 of his sons, and he gets to number 6, and we read, when they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is standing in front of me. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his height, or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Meaning I did not select him for this assignment. God does not see as man sees, since man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And of course, it goes on to, don't you have another son? Oh yeah, David, he's just out in the field, what do you want with him? Of course, David is the one who becomes anointed. Again, Jesus here in Luke 11 is going to give 6 examples, which, by the way, were so egregious, they were deserving of God's judgment, so that gets our attention. But these are examples where the people of his day took the light that they once had from God and hid it, just like the last passage said, no one after lighting a lamp puts it in the cellar or puts it in a basket. As we move through this, as we always strive to do, let us not point fingers for others at their shortcomings, but let us look in the mirror to identify our shortcomings. I think we can, maybe if we're honest, we can identify with these 6 woes, and that should be kind of a wake-up call to get right and get back on track. Look for those areas where we have taken the light of Jesus and hid it in a cellar. It says he reclined to eat. This sounds casual to us, but in fact, this is Luke telling us it was a formal meal. And although this lunch discussion is about to go off the rails, as far as the Pharisee who invited Jesus is concerned, don't miss the significance of the invitation. Dining was a huge deal, and as we're studying in Deuteronomy, every meal was an opportunity for communion with your neighbor and none other than God himself. Therefore, it was not a thing to be taken lightly. Every meal could be viewed as a type of sacrifice. So with the one whom one dined was very significant, and it was almost as if they were entering into a covenant. Long story short, based on what we think we know, Pharisees would only dine with other Pharisees. So I'm not saying Jesus was a Pharisee. We'll have to ask him when we see him, but there's some evidence to suggest that Jesus was apparently enough aligned with the Pharisees, at least in principle, to be invited to fellowship. And we see this, rather combative nature with the Pharisees, but sometimes those who are most alike are the ones who divide the steepest here. His forthcoming pronouncements of judgment can't be against all Pharisees. And I've said this before too. We know Paul was and continued to be a Pharisee after his Damascus Road experience. We can read that in Acts 20. The Damascus Road experience was in Acts 9, but where he says, I am a Pharisee, that's actually Acts 23. Not I was a Pharisee, but I still am a Pharisee. We know of many Pharisees who came to faith, Acts 15:5. The Chosen actually does a good job of this. It's fictional, but they're historically accurate, where they portray several Pharisees Pharisees as becoming believers and then trying to look out for them. There is no record of a Sadducee coming to faith, and perhaps why they're a Sadducee. I couldn't resist digging that one in. Again, it's those whom we're closest to that we have these harsh disagreements sometimes. But in any case, Jesus loves to eat, and he often uses table fellowship to reach people. And he's continuing that theme of light versus darkness as metaphors for a person's spiritual condition. Of course, I believe that in this context, his wish is not to condemn, but to spur the people to repentance. We just got through talking about the sign of Jonah and Nineveh, and we, no reason not to think that many at the meal may have repented. When the Pharisee saw this, he was surprised that Jesus had not first ceremonially washed before the meal. The Pharisees, along with other Jewish sects, took ritual cleanliness far beyond what was required by the Torah. Even today, rabbinic laws prescribe that hand washings be done at certain times and in certain ways, as you can see in this photo from the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The belief surrounding hand washing was something like this. If God wants us clean when we come before him in the temple, and that's what's written in the Torah, and we desire to be before him not just in the temple, but in all aspects of our lives, how much more should we be ritually clean in all aspects of our lives? And so this was the thought. The cleanliness was primarily for going to the festivals and going up to the temple, but they wanted to be ritually clean at all times because they always wanted to be ready to be in front of God. So if that's the strategy, it was possibly fine, but it was the execution that becomes a problem. What started from a source of pure motives and pursuing righteousness turned into a checkbox, an external sign that if I do it, I'm okay, but if I don't do it, or if my neighbor does not do it, then he or she is not okay. Some actually suspect the Pharisees and the Essenes, who were the Qumran community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they might have used hand washing, what we might today call it a virtual signal. It became a way of distinguishing those on our team from those who are not on our team. And if that was the reason, then it was definitely a flawed strategy. But the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but your inside is full of greed and wickedness. You foolish ones, did he who made the outside not make the inside also? But give that which is within as a charitable gift. Then all things are clean for you." Stone vessels, as you can see in this picture, were common in Jerusalem. Because of rabbinic laws, stone doesn't transmit ritual impurity the way pottery does. As the Pharisee did, this is kind of interesting. In Luke 7:39, you have almost a very similar thing where a Pharisee never says anything out loud. This guy doesn't say anything either. And so if he was surprised that Jesus didn't wash before the meal, he must have been really surprised when Jesus speaks up. And it says he was astonished that he did not wash before dinner. Jesus knows his thoughts and then has a very strongly worded rebuke. This section here blends passages that Matthew has separated out. We've seen some components of the Sermon on the Mount here in Luke, which comes from Matthew 5, verses 7. That was up in the Galilee. Matthew has the bulk of this exchange in Matthew 23 during Jesus' Passion Week in Jerusalem. There are also elements of this hand-washing discussion in Matthew chapter 15 and Mark 7 when Jesus was back in Galilee. So the question is this the same event that we're conflating? Or more, for me, I would side with the commentators who see Luke's account of Jesus dining with the Pharisees as being weeks or maybe even months before his final week. This appears to be a private encounter, whereas Matthew 23 is definitely in a public forum. We can see that by Matthew 23, verse 1. Jesus spoke to the crowds, and you have these very, very similar words here. I think back on my own experience as a corporate trainer, and I did road shows many times in multiple cities. I would say substantively the same thing in each location, but if you compare the transcript, there might be several differences, including times where I just change things up just not to be repetitive, even if I'm the only one listening to it. Jesus may have done something like that here, which is where we get these little different distinctions between Matthew and Luke. For example, in Luke, Jesus is going to make a reference to having an unmarked grave and being unclean inside. In Matthew 23, the reference is going to be to a marked grave and have things unclean inside. So did he refine his message? Did he change things up? I tend to believe it was more along those lines versus that these are the same story that the two gospel writers just couldn't get correct. We mentioned before the two schools of Pharisees that existed in Jesus' day. One was led by Shammai and the other was led by Hillel. Hillel had passed away when Jesus was a child, but the school of thought that bore his name continued on under the direction of Gamaliel. And we see Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, who was Paul's teacher. It was Shammai, though, the kind of the opposing thought, who taught that the outside of the cup could be ceremonially clean, even if the inside were not. Hillel taught that the inside of the cup must be cleaned first. So this exchange that Jesus is having appears to be with someone from the house of Shammai. Jesus sides with Hillel, as he usually does, though he doesn't do that exclusively. And so this has to illustrate a question that becomes obvious once we know some context. When the gospel writers say Pharisees, we need to ask, which Pharisees do you mean? The answer is included in the text, but if we don't know this thing about the inside of the cup versus the outside of the cup, we wouldn't have any clue. But with his background, we can start to tell a difference. So as we like to say, it's not all Pharisees. We need to ask which Pharisees are in view here. This concept of internal cleanliness is not new with Jesus. In fact, we can see that it was always God's will to have certain things come first, meaning love and walking with God and serving him. And then follow out of that, the keeping the law should come. Whenever we start to keep the laws first, then things get out of order. Deuteronomy 10, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Now, if I stop here and I asked the average Christian what Deuteronomy says is the number one thing that God required, they would probably say keep the law. But notice that's not listed first here. First is fear the Lord your God, walk in his ways, love him, serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Then keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today for your good. There's a listing of 5 here. Just like there are 10 commandments, there are 5 basic requirements. That's probably not by accident. You have this grouping of 5 because it fits on 5 fingers. And so they can memorize the 10 commandments by 1 for each finger. And you also have this grouping of 5 here that seems to fit on the hand. And so if we note the order, the first requirement, as I mentioned, is not to keep the law, but to fear the Lord. That comes from Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the understanding of the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. The second would be to walk in his ways. We like to say, how's your walk? A way or a path is a metaphor for how close are you with God, just like we say Talmudim way, is we're on this journey, metaphorically speaking. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. And so this journey that we're on is said to be our walk. And of course, the index finger, which points the way, is the way your walk should go. Number 3 is love. And Deuteronomy 6:5 says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Did you ever stop to think about the fact that you can't be commanded to love? It has to come from your heart. It has to be something you want to do. So these first 3, fear the Lord, walk in his ways, and love the Lord your God, are all begin in our heart. And then the next thing is, how do we show our love? Number 4 then is to serve. To love the Lord your God, you have to do it with your hands and feet. You can't just be someone who says, yeah, I love God, or I love my wife, but I don't show it. You've got to be doers of your word. And that's our verse, James 1:22. Prove yourself doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves. So again, show your love is you have to do that with your hands. Then we get to number 5, which is keep his commands. Placing these in any other order results in legalism. If you try to keep the 5th one and make it first and foremost, then you're out of balance and you're basically living a legalistic life. The Pharisees put number 5 first and foremost. They forgot the other 4, and they would probably answer the question, what does God require of you, with keep the law? But that's not how Moses answered the question here. Conversely, though, if you do the other 4 sincerely, beginning with fearing of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and then walking, loving, and serving, then keeping his commands becomes a joy. It's just something that happens naturally out of the result of the position of our hearts. We like to say it's a get to, not a got to. So in order to be clean, the inner attitudes of fearing, walking, and loving and serving must match the outward acts of keeping. And this is where we're getting into Jesus's criticism of those who would only focus on the external aspects. And so the rest of this passage could be viewed as Jesus's criticism of the lawyers and the Pharisees for missing these first 4 commandments. So remember the hand and keep these 5 things in order and commit them to memory also. But woe to you, Pharisees. We get into the woes here. For you pay tithes of mint, rue, and every kind of garden herb, yet you ignore justice and the love of God. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So probably intentionally alluding to Deuteronomy 10, which they should have known, and they probably did know. But he's pointing them back to these things. The way Luke has it divided, 3 of these 6 woes will be directed toward the Pharisees, and then the last 3 are going to be directed towards the lawyers. But the way Matthew has it, they're all combined. So woe number 1 is ritualism without love, putting your pinky first without remembering the first 4 things that God requires. Tithing is merely a form form of following God's will for your life. That's really all the commands are. After what he's done for you, how are you going to say thank you? Tithing is one of those ways. The good things that the Pharisees did here were not necessarily bad, but they were incomplete if they did not have a heart that sought God and sought to love his or her neighbor as his or herself. We see this in Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal one, what is good? What does the Lord require but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? They were not doing any of these things. They were just going through the external motions, and they passed over the justice and the love of God. They'd missed that. Deuteronomy 16:20 is interesting. It comes to us as justice and only justice shall you pursue. The literal Hebrew says righteousness, righteousness shall you pursue, so that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving to you. We like to say justice would be the gutters of the bowling alley. They'll let you know something's not right. You bump into them. And but what we really should be aiming for is righteousness. We aim for that pin, and we want to get a strike. We don't, if you're doing it right, you don't worry about the gutter. So that those things take care of themselves. Second, you love the seat of honor in the synagogues and personal greetings in the marketplace. This is speaking of pride. They let their pride get out of control. This is a beautiful synagogue in Jerusalem. It's got a fascinating history. Hopefully we can visit it when we go to Israel sometime in the near future. This choice of word is for love is fascinating because it's the Greek word agapeo. And often people think agapeo is only a positive love that God has for us. John 3:16, for God so agapeoed the world, if I could transliterate that. And and then conversely, it's something that we can never attain for God. In John chapter 21, Jesus asked Peter two times, do you agapeo me? And Peter's, he says, I do. And then finally he uses a different word at the end. Do you phileo me? And finally Peter says yes. And that's when he starts crying. But really, love is not necessarily, this agapeo word is not necessarily a positive love. Here, they agapeo the best seats of the synagogue. As Chuck Missler said, it's better to think of the Greek word agapeo as to be totally devoted or given over to? Is it the thing you are most pursuing in your life? Is it God or is it something else? What are you most pursuing? What are you agapeing after, to put it a certain way? This is a marketplace in Jerusalem, another fun place in Jerusalem. The greetings here might refer to an elaborate ritual that grew more and more ostentatious the higher the person's status was. And this might give some background to a passage we looked at sometime back in Luke 10. Carry no money belt, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one along the way. It's don't get caught up in these elaborate empty rituals. The task is too urgent for that. The third woe to you, for you are like unseen tombs, and the people who walk over them are unaware of it. This speaks to the mistake of not seeing us as God sees us. So basically Jesus is saying you're full of dead man's bones. You're like a tomb, and you're causing other people to become unclean without even knowing it. The primary and immediate context is seeing ourselves better than we actually are. But I think going the other way and doubting our value after God has redeemed us and restored us is also a form of this type of error. Many people in ministry deal with something called the imposter syndrome, and that's where we struggle with the fact that we're sinners. We don't feel worthy of our calling. We think, someone's going to stand up one day and denounce us as being worthless, and to some extent we would agree with them. But to be blunt, it doesn't matter what we feel. If God has called us, that should be all the affirmation we need. But again, the primary context is thinking you're superior when you don't realize that you're not, and that's Jesus' primary point. Walking over a grave caused ceremonial defilement, and so walking over an unmarked grave would make a person unclean, while that person would continue to think of himself as clean. This cemetery that you see here is located on the southeast side of the Dead Sea, and as you can see, it looks just like the desert, right? An unsuspecting passerby would not be able to tell that it's even a cemetery. Few things spread ritual uncleanliness like a corpse did. So to illustrate the man's impure motives, Jesus takes the most extreme case. Some even believe that allowing one's shadow to cross a grave rendered one ritually impure. The thought is the man's heart is way far from where the man himself thinks it is. That's Jesus' point. This comes from Numbers 16. Anyone who is in open field touches one who has been killed with a sword or has died naturally, or touches a human bone or grave, will be unclean for 7 days. For the purposes of maintaining ritual purity around the feast times, they would take whitewash and mark the tombs. And in this way, an unsuspecting visitor would not not accidentally come into contact and make themselves unclean for the feast. So in the Matthew 23 passage, Jesus compares the religious elite to these whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, but inside full of dead man's bones. Luke flips it around and says you don't even bother to mark your tombs. The uncleanliness is just a part of who you are, and you're contaminating everyone as you go throughout your day. One of the teachers said to him in reply, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us too." So this lawyer might have been politely trying to inform Jesus that maybe you're casting too wide of a net with this judgment. Let's think about this. He's probably going to wish he kept quiet because Jesus said, "Woe to you lawyers as well, for you load people with burdens that are hard to bear, while you yourselves will not even touch the burdens with one of your fingers." And so this speaks of the lawyers know the rule. These are Torah lawyers, not litigators like we think of today. So you should know the Torah. You should be teaching it and explaining it to others to make their walk easier. Not only are you not helping others, you yourselves know all the loopholes that you're putting this burden on other people while keeping the secrets to make life easier, keeping that for yourself. Luke here is careful to distinguish lawyers from the Pharisees. They're technically two different job descriptions, although there is some overlap. Matthew, in chapter 23 of Matthew, is going to group them together here. The sages referred to adherence to God's full set of commands in the Torah as taking on the yoke of the Torah. And as we saw with the 5 requirements in Deuteronomy 10, if one's heart is correct, then, to use a phrase, the yoke is easy and the burden is light. In other words, keeping the commands as an expression of thanks for all that God has done can be a joyful experience that leads to a disciplined life. How much more for us? When Jesus resurrected, he ushered in that portion of the new covenant where God wrote his Torah on our hearts. We have this inside of us, and it can be that experience that, again, comes from a joyful heart. However, we so easily and quickly fall into rules for rules' sake, and that is just empty religion and empty ritual. Woe to you! You build the tombs of the prophets, and it was your fathers who killed them. So you are witnesses, and you approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build their tombs. This, in a sense, in my view, is speaking of approval of, or even participation in wickedness. They thought they were honoring the prophets by building the tombs of the prophets. Some of these still stand today in the Kidron Valley. You can see those from the old city. But really, these people who did the building had more in common with those who killed the prophets. And what's interesting here geographically, and we'll get to this when we get to Matthew 23, Jesus could have been pointing to these very tombs as he makes the statement. So that's kind of interesting. Look at this tomb, though, as a side note. Look at you've got the Greek, this is a Jewish tomb, but you've got the columns, which remind you of Greek architecture, and then on the one on the left, which is Zechariah's tomb, you've got this top that looks like an Egyptian pyramid. So they're definitely mixing cultures. The word for that is syncretism, where you're mixing styles and thinking it's okay. Verse 49, for this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, some they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God. Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation. This wisdom of God is not a direct quote from the Old Testament or any extra biblical document, but it's possibly a direct warning from God himself about the consequences of persecuting the apostles in the coming years. And so this is like a prophecy, because we know what happened to the Old Testament prophets is going to happen to, starting with Stephen, and many of the apostles will be martyred for their faith. Abel, of course, is biblical Abel in Genesis 4. He was murdered by his brother. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Note how the blood cries out for justice. Some people see Abel to Zechariah as sort of being all-encompassing from A to Z. That really only works in English, because while Abel in Hebrew begins with the first letter, Aleph, of the Hebrew alphabet, Zechariah actually begins with the letter Zion, which is the 7th letter out of 22. So we can't get this beginning and end. More likely, though, the reference to Zechariah is because he is the last martyr recorded in the Hebrew Bible. They do it a little bit differently in the book order. And so the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, actually concludes with the book of Chronicles. And so near the end of the 2nd book of Chronicles, the Spirit of God covered Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, like clothing, and he stood above the people people and said to them, "This is what God has said. Why do you break the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper?" So he's prophesying against the nation there. "You have abandoned the Lord, so he has abandoned you." So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyards of the house of the Lord. And so what happens right after this is the nation is led off into captivity, and they're led off into Babylon. And of course, in 70 AD, you're going to have something similar because the nation will be dispersed, scattered throughout the Roman Empire, and the temple will be destroyed. Stephen, we mentioned him before, was the first martyr, and Jesus and many of the servants of the early church will follow in that grisly tradition of martyrdom that Jesus references from Abel to Zechariah. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not prosecute? They killed those who had previously announced their coming of the righteous one, and now you have become betrayers and murderers of him. These words are spoken by Stephen, who was, again, the first martyr. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves did not enter. You hindered those who were entering. When he left that place, the scribes and Pharisees began to be very hostile, I bet, and interrogate him about many subjects, plotting against him to catch him in something he might say. This woe is becoming a wall. You're supposed to be an open door pointing to the Messiah and pointing to the good things of God, but basically you've locked it up and you've thrown away the key. And that's what MacArthur said. They locked up the truth of the scriptures and thrown away the key. This word catch, to catch something implies to hunt as a wild beast, so to lie in wait and catch your prey. Keener writes that lawyers in that day were supposed to increase the knowledge of God's law among the people. So for Jesus to charge them that their detailed expositions of the law instead rendered it inaccessible would have been a serious accusation, and they definitely take offense to it. Let's review these 6 woes, because I think we are susceptible to these also. So first is external ritualism. We've got no heart component. Let's remember that we want to be believers and followers from the inside out, and not just through external acts. Second is pride, drawing attention to our status. We're all guilty of that. That's a very common issue that humankind deals with. Third, not seeing ourselves as God sees us. 4, failure to show mercy and encouragement when that's called for. 5, approval of wickedness. Remember the phrase silence is consent, and there's a lot that goes on that we should be speaking up about, but we get coward and timid and sometimes bullied into keeping silent. And then the last is the assumption that we hold the key to spiritual knowledge, but we aren't sharing it. We become a wall when we should be an open door. So some things to think about from the end, as we said, at the end of chapter 11. So next time we'll be in Luke chapter 12, and we'll see you again along the Talmudim way.